Hello, welcome to the podcast. I'm Chris Lockhart. This is Consultants Saying Things. Today, we're actually talking about a subject that I think is one of the top buzzwords that I encounter on a day-to-day basis. The concept of DevOps and delivery execution and using methodologies such as Agile and things of that nature. And we, in addition to Phil Yanoff and Bill Bensing, we have a guest, Pete Hurd, who is joining us from over in the UK. Pete is the founder of Logic Room and has been involved in development and delivery and creating, really high-performing teams for his clients for a number of years. So consider him an expert in the field. I think it's a pretty good discussion. So hopefully you'll join us for Consultants Saying Things, the one about DevOps, and buckle up. Here we go. Maybe you could give us like the 2-minute overview of sort of your view of what it means to deliver effectively, right? And then we can talk about maybe ways that we can make that happen better for our clients.
I guess in terms of actually delivering working software for companies, be it small sort of single instance web apps to massive platforms, I think what delivery actually means to me is doing it well. And when you actually the history I've got is sort of in things like test driven development and automation. And when I actually sit down and I look at Agile and test driven development and all these things, and now DevOps, most of it comes down to removing uncertainty. And when you remove uncertainty, what you're trying to say is that as a sort of independent unit within the business, be that myself as a developer or myself as part of a team or that team as part of a business function, is that we can give complete clarity in terms of what we are delivering to give a very much a red light, green light indication as to whether it works. And the definition of it works is obviously flexible, and probably talk more about that later. But in terms of being able to actually say yes, it does completely work, or no, it doesn't completely work, is ultimately what all of these things are trying to get down to. And part of that is to remove that uncertainty from the whole chain, the delivery chain.
I think a lot of people that are working on some of these methodologies are looking at it as a way to speed things up, right? To be faster at doing something, right? And what I hear you saying is, it's maybe more around clarity and certainty about what it is that you're doing, right?
I would say you could do DevOps without automation. When I look at what DevOps is in general, you think about handoffs and flow and how things go to achieve quality. The definition of done is fundamentally what's the definition of quality. So I'd like to see what you think about this. I would almost say that I wanted to write this, Pete, for a long time. I said DevOps is dead. Actually, I think it's become more DevOps is extremely bastardized or misunderstood. And so I'd almost say like you could do DevOps without automation, but it comes back to what you're talking about, the definition of done. And I think this is where most people probably lose a bit of focus, is they want to get in GitLab, they want to get in Jenkins, they want to get in Ansible, they want to get in Puppet Chef, whatnot. But that's the hows. Nobody's talking about the what. And there's the what just to figure out what you're creating, and then what defines done.
It's interesting because I've always, obviously, like you say, everybody's got their own opinion on what DevOps is, just like everybody had their own opinion on what Agile is. And, and I think these are great frameworks for improving it, because ultimately what they come down to is a language. And the idea behind a language is that you encapsulate a whole load of meaning underneath one word, and then that makes it easier to communicate. Otherwise, you're talking about nuts and bolts when you need to be talking about the car and the roads, And I guess the way that I sort of summed up DevOps was like, it's like a cultural thing. It's like a culture of automation, and it's a culture of integration. But it's interesting the way that you're looking at that. It's like, well, actually, that's not really what DevOps is about. It's about the outcome to that. And I guess in a way, you're right. The outcome, if it's about removing risk, doesn't necessarily need automation. I mean, the definition of risk in a business is something where you burn up cash too quickly and you go out of business. I mean, that is the most risky situation to be in. Well, if I'm going to burn up like, £100,000 automating something, but it's only going to bring me $99,999.99, that's a high, that's too much risk, right? But if I can do that job for 80 grand with engineers who are absolutely certain that the job will be done, pretty good engineers, I guess, but they're out there, I'm sure. They work here, obviously. But then like it's not really about the automation. It's about that clarity, which is interesting, because that's much more about the way that you actually come to agreement with somebody what's important. And I think that the journey that I've been on, when I first started Logic Room, it was all about that automation is important, TDD is important, but now I think where we've got to the company is our appreciation of you have to find your own way, and that every team is different, and that every situation is different, and what works in one situation and context won't necessarily work in the other, which is why things like DevOps and Agile can be a little bit worrying sometimes, because it's just a cookie cutter approach. Here's your DevOps, here's your Agile, boom, sorted. And of course that's great for selling stuff, but does it actually get to the root cause, the thing that we're all trying to achieve, which is basically better business? I mean, this is for we're talking about here about developing software for some sort of business, 99% of the time. So I think it's interesting to look at it like that. I hadn't quite thought about that. So
it's funny you talk about language. And this is actually very cool happenstance. So you happen to be English, and I lived in France for a while. I had 2 English roommates. And you think about, we both speak English, right? I don't think there's any disagreement. We speak English. But when you think about language and language in business, I remember we were going to an all-white party where everybody wears all white. And I just moved in, didn't have white, I guess you would say, trousers. So I went to the girls and I said, "Hey girls, I need to go shopping. Do you want to go with me and get me some white pants?" And they, you already smiled. They looked at me like, "Who are you, creep?" And I'm like, "I need to get some white pants." They're like, "Do you need white trousers?" And tying this language thing back to DevOps, what I realized is, even though I was saying pants, what they heard me say was, in American English, it'd be underwear. And so they heard me say, "Well, do you want to go underwear shopping?" And it was a horrible language mistake. Then did I figure out what pants actually meant? So I used trousers for the rest of the year.
Well, I was going to say, you should have offered to wear them on the outside of your trousers for the superhero effect.
There you go.
I think you normally do that, isn't how you normally wear?
What's different, right?
You think about like the language thing, and I love how you bring out the language of DevOps and thinking of it as a culture, as a mindset. Have you read or have you listened to? Well, let me ask this first question. I think it's yes. Just got to ask it. Have you read the Phoenix Project?
Yes.
Have you listened to Gene Kim? They put on, I'll call it a little podcast. You can get it on Audible. It's called Beyond the Phoenix Project.
No, I haven't. Is Gene Kim's the author, isn't it? Isn't he? Yeah. No, I haven't. I haven't. I have to write that down.
Oh, I listened to it. It's about 7 hours of like sort of podcasting like this. You want to geek out. It's amazing. But what I wanted to bring down was like the idea of language and how we language DevOps. And I love how you were talking about like everybody's going into their own concept, because it gets what Chris was sort of talking about.
I think this comes down to, I don't want it to sound too cynical, but I think it's very easy to package up, to see a trend in the IT industry, and is to sort of ride the crest of that wave, and is to say, this is a new movement that's coming out, let's what's it all about, and you can almost go to, say, conferences. What's the big thing on the horizon? Like I've seen that this, I think GitOps is probably going to be one of the next big things. And, you can sort of see where these trends are going, and you can start to sell them. And I think that's one reason. It's not the only reason. And but I think the reason that works is because firstly, everybody starts trying to sell things like DevOps, starts trying to sell Agile. And then the way that you sell those things is to, offer it as a solution to the problems. And the problems, in my opinion, the problems often come down to this, this risk and uncertainty and this exploding cost that you always get in software, where cost starts to mushroom and balloon. And of course, these things like DevOps, they're very nice little things to just sort of plonk on top and go, well, DevOps solves this. To a certain extent, I think it's like cases of the emperor's new clothes. I don't think these are bad movements. I think these are all positive steps in the right direction. But I think fundamentally what they actually are about is about having a better language. I'm sort of the thoughts that Agile has improved the industry, even though a lot of people don't think it has. I'm sort of the thoughts that DevOps is a step in the right direction. But I think where I've had some good success in terms of writing about content and making videos, and certainly with propositioning Logic Room as a potential solution, is that we've specifically tried to keep buzzwords out of the conversation. And we specifically tried to stay away from that, because what that forces us to do is to put it in a language that we try hard to resonate with the customer, and that actually gets down to the fundamental level of communication, which is to actually enable somebody to understand you. And then you can tell them, by the way, this is what DevOps is talking about, and this is what Agile is talking about. And then that way people can come to their own conclusions without, as soon as you mention DevOps, I've got to read a DevOps book. And then suddenly they're being told what to think, instead of really getting down to the fundamental, the fundamental idea behind this. And that's just a realization that I've come to, and even the people, my brilliant colleagues here, that we all sort of subscribe to, is that things are too complicated and they rapidly, balloon out of control. And it's all right for us guys, because we're all technical and we can go, yeah, DevOps, yeah, heard it all before. But I mean, unfortunately, a lot of the people who are in business, I went to a CIO conference the other day, and I can imagine that, a lot of the CIOs, I wouldn't necessarily just want to start talking about these things without just having a normal conversation with them first, because I just think it's helpful to engage people that might be interested in these services on a more natural level. And I think that if you can do that, then you start to increase the ability to communicate. And I think that should come first before the movements. So
I like that. I think you're so key on with the communication aspect. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I've seen this too. So when you're talking to outside the technical realm, you use DevOps or Agile. Besides eyes glazing over, there's no analogy in general. There's no good analogy that's been out there in general. So I like how you term that. Side note, I just like your recent article you wrote about functional versus OO programming.
Oh, thank you.
I love the outlook. That's why I said I think we share a similar mindset. It's the religions of one tool versus one approach over the other.
Yeah, I mean, it's just interesting to look at these things, and you sort of see it. You look both sides of it, and it's quite fascinating, really, that. And people really hold on to it. And, we've all got a bias, right? I mean, as humans, we've got a bias towards whatever we've sort of cottoned onto. Even right now, as I'm speaking, I will have a bias onto the thing that I'm talking about, what it is I've decided. And, I'll defend it till, I'll sort of clutch onto it. This is my idea and I want to hold on to it. So, I think it's just nice to try and, observe from both angles and, So, thank you.
Pete, do you see that from is that a regional or cultural or background or just sort of level of sophistication? I mean, assuming you're going out to CIO conferences, you're talking to other people, I'm assuming that you're seeing some of this at least at a global scale. I'm curious as to how you see different areas adopting these ideas at different levels.
I can't really see any. To be honest, the only thing I can see that's consistent is confusion amongst it. I see. Obviously, we're still a fairly small company. So if we had, if we were like a few hundred people and we were more integrated in bigger things, I might be able to give you a more clear answer. But most of my knowledge comes from the few clients that we've got, but also a lot of the online stuff that I'm doing, the conversation that I've been having, and the only thing that I can get is that nobody can really agree on anything. It's just that when you actually peel a lot of the layers off, you get the same fundamental things, and so it's almost like it's all a bit of a mishmash, to be honest.
Right.
I'm looking at just this ocean of cubicles, right, and team areas, and has a very communal sort of. I don't know. It's like the individual is somehow lost in this process, right? Yeah. And I know you've spoken or written about, right, sort of optimizing around the individual, right, as opposed to the team and these sorts of things. But how does that play into it? Because I mean, I certainly don't see anyone anywhere I go talking about we're gonna optimize for this process for the individual, right? And that will improve our delivery efforts.
So my thoughts are that I think it came from like a personal experience where I used to get so frustrated with, you'd open up a code base, and from the very first day, I knew there was something wrong with what I was looking at, because although I started as a, trainee or junior programmer, that there was just all this like tangled up code. And I had luckily I worked with one. I worked in this really big place, and I worked with one really good programmer who was just really, I guess, really fastidious and was just really diligent about his code, and would just always wanted to collapse functions down and write meaningful names. And he was the first one, sort of taught me about, object-oriented programming. And, I was like, well, why is that important? Why are interfaces important? And he explained to me, the ideas behind polymorphism and encapsulation. And I guess I was always like, well, why can't everybody do this? And I went, a few years later, I went to learn about Agile, and I did Scrum, did a Scrum Master training. And I thought, oh, maybe that's the answer. But then I went in there, and it was like lots of project managers. And then I got, after that, I saw, well, Scrum. I was on a Scrum team, really good Scrum, but the stuff that was coming out was still rubbish. And so then I thought I spent the next few years and slowly got onto this whole test-driven development thing and learning about the clean architecture. And I suddenly found that writing code in that format was so much easier, and the code was so much more robust, and it was so much more enjoyable. And really, because what I realized is that there are certain ways of working, and this is not about technology, this is about disciplines and practices, that when you do them, allow you to mitigate against your own complete failings as a human, which are that you get easily distracted, like you go out and have beer, so then you have a hangover, so you get even more distracted. You are, if you're me, you're not that intelligent. I mean, you're a clever guy, but genius. And, you sort of see all these things happening that are just designed to distract you. Now you've got, it's even worse with social media and stuff, that really what you need to do good work. You need a comfortable, clear environment with some sort of level of automation around you, so that you're literally just thinking almost like in a linear fashion, but you can think in multiple levels, but it has to just be in one sphere of information. So writing code in a TDD environment is a perfect example, because you can keep running code and you can leave behind past information, but that what you're doing, the journey that you're taking, is completely up to date. You've removed all past certainty, and you get this really nice effect of just slowly building on top with clear information. And it's my thought that if everybody was to work in that way, that you would reach a state of flow, and a state of flow is the optimal being. And if everybody came together and was working in a state of flow, that you would have for most of the time, you would have a hyper performant team. Is that, the state of flow would be part, you're communicating and collaborating, and that the work that you're doing is of high quality, and that you've always removed this uncertain risk. So you're never going backwards, because if you look at the definition of flow, you're always moving forward, and you've got the right level of difficulty in front of you. And that, my thoughts were that basically, it has to start with the individual, and it has to start with creating teams of people who are individually fulfilled and are individually doing high quality work. And that's just writing code, but in IT there's all sorts of other work. There's business analysis. I believe that a good business analysis will have the right support structures around them, so that they can document what software has to do in a way that works for them, in a way that's structured, it's methodical, it builds upon last iterations. If you're testing, is that your testing efforts never go backwards. If you have to do manual testing, so the information systems and the people that help you with your testing are always building on top of each other. And part of that comes into having automation to know that you're not detecting a bug twice, because that's just annoying. And that as you optimize for the individual, because that's where it all starts, and then you slowly build up. And if you have a happy individual, those people, they have lower anxiety and lower stress. And when you have lower anxiety and lower stress, you're more likely to work well as a team. That's my sort of thought pattern on that.
The thing is, as I heard Pete say it, well, if you want to be the next Pete Hurd, you should probably be smarter than you are already. I think he's got a secret advantage there. But when you talk about flow, I mean, that is a form of happiness, right? I mean, in fact, that's the original
ultimate happiness. Yeah.
That is a state of happiness in addition to all the others that we know about, right? Mm-hmm. And that was what the whole process is about. And what I hear Pete saying is, let's get rid of all these other distractions. Let's kind of focus on a few things. And remember, this state of flow is the state where all my inner voices about these distractions fall away, and I get to just the thing we're working on, right? And so if we want to call it being in the zone or coding in the zone, this is what I think you really want. I mean, we want laminar flow of our developers when they're developing. Now, I think there's a moment for conflict, right? And I don't think we're talking about conflict about environmental concerns, but I mean, we don't always know what the best path to a thing is. And that's a point where I think we have to kind of come together and figure those bits out, right? But then once we agree that this is the direction which we're heading, again, I think this whole idea of a laminar flow of ideas, how do we do it with, reducing turbulence, right? How do we go straight ahead all together? I think that's a great idea. And I think that is a thing that I don't think that I hear a lot of people talking about of how do I be happy where I could think, I thought of like one software developer who I think they get this idea, and he never said it quite this way.
Yeah.
His idea was, how do I put a team together that is more effective? And he was trying to working on some other thoughts, but I think what he really wanted was this. He wants people working in coordination.
Yeah.
So what if I said, so from the history buff, Chris, what if I told you all this has been solved and it was solved as an outcome of World War II? But because the software engineering and software development background, just computer science in general, they've been borrowing from, I mean, you think about architect is a 3,000-year-old concept. Engineer is a 3,000-year-old concept. This is all first Roman, Greek, right? So we're architects, we're engineers.
Yeah.
What if I told you a lot of this was solved? And so as I heard you talking, Pete, have you heard of Deming's 14 principles?
I've heard of Deming's, but I've only heard of this cycle, not the 14 principles.
So you hear the plan, do, check, act. Check out the 14 principles. What I would almost argue, and it's funny as you're talking about this, because I see you having this realization. And I see a lot of people having this, and this goes back to the lean. So we think about DevOps, people talk about lean, and then people stop at the bastardization of lean and don't go any further into why and how it came about. But you look at like Deming, look at Taiyo Chiono, and as you go into, as you listen to Beyond the Phoenix Project, you'll hear a lot about this. I almost see you're rediscovering in the software with the DevOps push. People are rediscovering, and I go back to manufacturing engineering because this is really what it is. It's how to manufacture software. I would almost say that nobody's really thought about how to manufacture software. And in late 2000s, somebody says, we need to figure out how to do this better. So we're going to have coin this concept called DevOps, now DevSecOps, WinOps, and you're talking about GitOps and everything now. But we're going to coin this concept because we want to have this journey to figure out how do we do software better, because frankly, up until 2000, mid-2000s, software wasn't that big of a deal in the world. And this is my thesis until the first iPhone came out. Nobody gave a care about software, manufacturing software. It was expensive up until then, and it was allowed to be expensive because frankly, it was an exception to the norm. Even though a lot of people still used it underneath, it was the exception to the norm in the consumer market. But once it became valuable to consumer market, and it went from billions to trillions in returns. Then all of a sudden people are like, oh crap, we can't keep doing what we've been doing since the 50s and 60s. We need to figure out how to manufacture this. So we've borrowed from everybody else's concepts, try to put something called DevOps, and we have made it so hard and so ambiguous and just thrown technology behind it that now people are asking again as they're developing GitOps and whatnot, what's the different and better way to do this? Sorry, I was going on a bit of a ramble there.
I absolutely agree with you. It is like a circle of understanding, and I've come to the conclusion, and it's like, okay, so obviously this is what everybody is coming to.
You're not going to learn how to do DevOps if you only think about if you think about software. I would argue that if you want to do DevOps really well, go understand manufacturing engineering, go look at the basis of systems design, and go to a bit of the history and understand how physical goods are manufactured, handoffs are made, handoffs are reduced, how they're optimized. And if you understand that, and this is why I go back to DevOps, is you can do DevOps without automation. If you understand your flow, exactly what you're talking about, and you understand what you're doing and why you're doing it, because you want to achieve this outcome organizationally to produce software as a product, then you are getting down to the roots of what DevOps is. And then this confusing talk around DevOps when it comes to CI/CD pipelines and Kubernetes, containers, container orchestration, all that other kind of stuff, that stuff falls into place because you realize, like, what am I doing, right? If I'm building an at-scale platform, I have to be highly abstract. I need to run into a world. I'm cloud native. What's cloud native? Because that's becoming the big buzz term now. Thank you, Pivotal. I love the term, but it's and so as I go back to, like, don't study software. Study manufacturing engineering. As I listen to people and I listen to you talk about it, it's awesome. You're like, it's the flow. It's about the feedback. It's about I see the grasp there, and everybody's talking about it. Nobody's talking about it like you are. Not many people are, because they just want to sell you a $280 an hour job. to put your Jenkins in.
Yeah.
Yeah, not that Pete doesn't want to do that, right? Let's just
hey, look, I'll take your money.
What are some secrets that we can share here on how to better manage teams of these individuals that are delivering, and manage them so that we're delivering more effectively? Maybe not faster, maybe not cheaper, maybe not better, but more effectively, whatever that is.
So right off the top of my head, the one thing that I'm really keen on, it's going to sound like a bit like I'm buying vegetables here, but I think source locally. There's something I think that we've often lost. The sort of the work. What I think is really important is that we work as part of a tribe when we're doing the sort of critical work that we're doing. And I am really, really keen on hiring developers and other people that work with us who live around the local area. And the first, I guess, is from a performance level. Having looked into the research, people are just a little bit more. They're a little bit less stressed if they haven't had to travel for an hour and a half. And the second thing is that, if they live locally, we've already got a lot in common. And, I mean, for example, last Friday, there was a film festival on Friday, and, I bumped into one of the engineers here, and, we're only a small company, but it was, really nice to bump into somebody that, I work with in the local arts center. And, then I saw some other people on the Saturday, and, it just adds a little bit of extra, I think it's just nice to have to work with people who live in the local area. I think that's really important to have that community. And certainly the way that I want to build my team is that we are a tribe with a common purpose and, common goals. And it really helps if we all sort of we live local, because then we have that support structure as well. And I know if there's ever a problem, someone can't get into work, I can go around to their house. Or, I had an operation about 4 weeks ago. My business partner was able to just come to the house, and, we had a meeting in my house. And I think that's the first way, because that adds a certain level of team spirit. That's the first way. And the second way is to not have any rules until you absolutely need the rules. So, for example, our working policy is flexible. I know that one of the engineers who works here today, said to me, "Pete, is it all right if I go home at 11:30?" And I said to him, we'll work from home. I said, I said to him, "Well, what's our policy on that?" And he said, "Well, I don't know." And I said, "Well, I guess we haven't got one." And it was more of a sort of question, because he, as my business partner has been working here with him more closely, and we don't really have a policy on that. But what we've tried to say is, it's flexible, but we really think that we need about 3 days in the office, and that's certainly what I want to come in. But that's not because we have to, and those aren't fixed. That's more because we think that's roughly what we need in order to decrease bottlenecks. And when there are problems, we think that there's so much more value of coming into the office. And what I try and say to the people I work with, and we're a young company, I'm still working this out. What I try and say is, try and come in as you see the problems arise, and just try and collaborate with who's going to be in and when, and try and make it more of a flexible affair. And then that way you've got the freedom to not even ask can you go home early, is you just tell me you're going home early, because I have enough trust in you that I don't need to be sitting there going, "Oh, I'm being asked a question, now I've got to make a decision," So I'd say those are my two things, is to try and work with people from the local area, and is to, just have no rules until needed. And the rules that you do have, just make sure they're focused on the outcomes. And, for us, that's just about best results for our clients.
So from some of my most recent experience, I had people under me that were as old as 61 and as young as 20s. What I noticed was even across that whole spectrum of range and experience and behaviors is the drive for thought. They want somebody who's going to be a thought leader. They know, your best people know that everybody's everybody is they're not infallible. At the end of the day, that people are error prone, but they want a leader out there who's pushing, who's looking, who's thinking. So Chris, to answer your question there, first off, I think you have to be a thought leader. I think today, especially when it comes to the DevOps and some of the software management aspect, there's no such, they're software managers out there nowadays, but if you're going to be good, you're going to run a high performing team. You're not managing anything. The team manages themselves.
Yeah.
To be a thought leader.
Yeah.
And that's pushing thoughts, pushing ideas, being out there, and working with the team from that thought perspective. I saw so much how a team of mine, they just, some of them challenged the heck out of me, and I challenged the heck out of them.
Yeah.
And the solutions that came forward were nothing that any of us on our own could have ever thought were the best ones. It was always a collaboration.
Yeah.
Second one is communication. So I always do this. I call it my propaganda machine, i.e. why you see this setup and everything here. I'd show it to you, but I firmly believe as any leader in an organization, you have to have a propaganda machine. And I use that word because I want it to be very visceral because of what propaganda means. All the way down to your documentation of your software, how it works, your architecture. It's all designed to be propaganda to sell an idea or sell a philosophy for people to buy into.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah. So, I'm just gonna write this down.
So like it's in your software engineer, your junior engineer, even some of your more senior engineers, they're not going to write propaganda, and that's okay. Get somebody who's really think about marketing communications, podcasts, little videos, Chris, like this. These are extremely powerful inside of an organization because people, when you talk about, they establish clarity, they help people understand why. When you get into highly complex systems with a lot of overhead, the why can be very ambiguous, and so can be the what, and so the how. I mean, you have a lot of layers there that people just need something to latch onto. And so building a propaganda machine is good. I think I was okay with it in some of my positions. I wasn't as good, but I keep practicing propaganda more and more and more. That's why I'll be the next presidential nominee for the United States. We'll see how well that works.
There's a software engineer. It could happen.
This is a thing where you're headed with this. What you are trying to get CIOs to change, their behaviors or to change the way they interact with the teams. I think one of my concerns might be that they don't care about this stuff. My question is, do they even see a problem to begin with? And how do you go about convincing them otherwise?
It's a really good question. So you can't really, if I want to sell to someone at any level, if CIO is obviously quite high, then I literally can't, I can't tell him what the problem is because everybody buys for their own reasons. And so if you want to get change, you really have to ask the question first and, sort of find out what the problems may be. Now, the problem is you don't really know the right questions to ask either. So they're not telling you what the problems are. You can't find out what the problems are, which is why what I usually do is try and start, with an honest story about my story, our story, about where we were and where we sort of got to, and I guess the conclusion that we've arrived to as a business. And I guess we are looking for a narrowed down version of the type of customer that we deal with, and someone who has seen the sort of problems and really wants better performance. All I can say is that I think that the higher the management, the more interested in the basics they are about things like time and cost. Because when you're at that level of an organization, you really have very few levers that you can pull. I think someone at that level has, increase cost, decrease cost, hire, fire, and there's not much they can do. So I think if you can talk to them in terms of like time, scheduling and resources, I think as you go lower down, development managers, it's like, maybe interested in bugs and defect rate and quality and things like that. But it's, it's certainly tough. And I think that really it's interesting. It's interesting what Bill was saying there about the thought leadership. I guess the reason that I try and do a bit of thought leadership is to put a message out which will hopefully just resonate with someone that might have seen sort of problems that come about, with the thoughts that they, might be interested in. Hey, we know that every movement ultimately will be upgraded. Maybe Pete could help us improve and take to the next evolution of Agile, whether that's he's got the answers or he helps us find the answers, And that's really sort of where my head's at the moment on that.
There is a mindset of, there's a budget, right? There is a timeline. There is, this is what I've committed to the board or whomever, right? And these are the things that we have to deliver. So deliver those things. I don't care necessarily if the individuals are happy. Now, they would never say that. And if you ask them, they would say, of course I do, right? But I think the mindset's very much like, I'm about pushing stuff out the door that's good. So that we can meet our target objectives. So when you're in the middle of an engagement, I'm trying to get your perspective on this, right? If you're in the middle of an engagement and there's that meeting or that steering committee discussion or whatever, where it's like, well, where are we with this? Is there a way to maybe tell a story about this topic and why it matters and why it's important without having to get into defect rates and, delivery timelines and money spent and things of that nature, because those are great graphs to have, right, in a slide deck, right, when you're presenting. But it seems to me like there's maybe a way to tell a story about this that is more compelling. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be, I think the thing I've learned about this business so far is you have to be really, really careful that you don't, it's fine to do the whole thought leadership outside, and I put that hat on and I start doing the, articles and all that lot. You have to be really careful once you actually go into a company that you don't wear that same hat, and that you have to take that off and almost throw it out, and then you just literally, you have to almost, completely remove it, because you can come across sometimes as a bit, I guess, lectury, or, you're sort of, you're still got your thought leader hat. And of course, that's not what they want. They see you've got an idea and they're interested in your ideas, but really anybody, any level of organization, regardless of either they're a developer or they're a CIO, because they're all basically humans, what they want really is, once you're in the door, they don't, my business coach calls it the little professor, and you want to be very careful that you're very careful about when you do that, and that that the whiteboard is closely guarded until you're asked to do that. And so if you think about that, you should only do that when you're asked to do that. You have to engage the conversation in a way that you all come to the conclusion that when the right time is right, that you say, would it be useful if I explained something? Would it be useful if I gave you my thoughts on this? And that is a very, very delicate thing to do. And it's something that I'm still learning. I've certainly fallen the cropper of it a couple of times. But that's you just got to be careful with it. And so.
So is that know your audience? Is that
yeah, it's like know your audience, like know when to speak, know when to shut up. Which is probably for me is quite hard.
No, that's a super powerful, simple thing, right? Know the audience, know when to shut up, right?
Are you telling me something, Chris?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I have this problem, right? I get up and I'll start going on and there'll be, Phil is listening to some of my stories while we're smoking cigars, and they go for hours, and it's unclear what the original was, right? So, no.
Sure, it's just a cigar you're smoking.
Good point. It seemed like 5 minutes to me, but it was hours to everyone else.
Well, I want to challenge something, Chris. So, what I keep hearing as I hear the theme behind your question there, and the response, Pete, that you're giving, is you guys are selling on bottom line. You're selling on bottom line outcome. What I would argue is DevOps. Think about DevOps today and the evolution towards DevOps. That has nothing to do with bottom line, and I think that's probably where the problem is. It's all about top line. Because when you look at a software manufacturing system, what you're doing is you're managing software as an output, which is really top line. And of course, bottom line will come as you become more efficient. But you got to be effective before you can be efficient. And I really can't think of anything in the world that you're efficient before you're effective.
In fact, some of those development methodologies are likely going to cost more, right? For skill, for number of people, tooling, whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
It may actually cost more. But I think you're right. The top line, the revenue potential, right, from delivering in this new fashion is the benefit. It's not.
Oh, right. I see what you mean. Yeah.
If you have a CIO or a CEO or somebody, the board, they want to reduce the cost of IT, of technology, of development.
Yeah.
This may not be the path to go down.
Actually, I think I'm learning. I'm learning something quite interesting here. And I was literally having this conversation today. We have some people helping us with our marketing, and I was like, it's really interesting because one of the things came up is, should we actually be selling to CIOs? Like, is that what we should be doing? And I think my business partner was sort of saying no, and I was like, well, yeah, because we can get a referral downwards in the organization, but actually. It's almost like, well, is there any point in targeting that? Because if they are interested in that, if we need to be selling more the efficiency rather than the cost, actually what we're talking about is efficiency, and that's how to more easily tell our story first. These practices and these disciplines. So that it's a really, really interesting insight. So thank you for that.
All right, so look, we've ranged over quite a few topics. I remain super fascinated by the fact that we didn't go like deeply technical on cloud containers or anything like that. I thought that was really fascinating, right? I mean, we talked about people basically for this entire time. So I guess, final thoughts. I mean, if you're out there and you're talking about DevOps or some of these methodologies for delivering more effectively, I mean, what are the two things? What are the top takeaways?
So I think two things. Let me keep it to two things. One, thought leadership. So if you're pushing DevOps, if you're trying to push this as a leader in your organization, you need to become a thought leader. And it's not just behind the technology. You have to do the tech for your team, but you have to be a thought leader in the broader aspect of software manufacturing for your organization, because you're going to have to lead up. Trust me, you'll have to lead up and across and everybody there. That's what you're going to have to do. That was number one. What was number two? Well, I'm gonna leave it there. I had a number two.
It's 1 and 2, right? They're both the same.
In my piece here, I think what I've seen in this is I think Pete's got some great ideas. One of the beautiful bits of this is he's done a great job of communicating them. And I don't know if that might have been where you were headed with it, Bill. You're talking about thought leadership, but quite frankly, me thinking great ideas at my desk and not sharing them with the world, that's not really useful to the world. The thing I like is Pete's not playing small, right? There's stuff out there on LinkedIn. There's things out in the world where he's kind of talking about his ideas. And I think this is one of those things that he's trying to change some people about how they're going about it. And it's not a one tap and done kind of a thing. No one's just going to hear it and say, I get it. I don't think, because there's some real behavioral change involved here. So it's tap, tap, tap. And I think he's doing a great job of getting the message out into the world. So bravo to you, Pete. Well done.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah. I mean, my takeaway from this is, and I don't know why, seems like I would have thought about this before, but, this idea that, the flow made up of individuals performing well as individuals, right? Making up a team. I mean, it seems so obvious, right? But I'm, not seeing a whole lot of that going on, a lot of focus on those individuals. And how powerful is that, right? To say, look, if you're happy with what you're doing, right, and you have the technical background and technical skill, and you can gel as that team, right, and have that sort of mutual trust and all that. I think that those are the high performing teams that we want to be part of. So that's kind of those. I don't think those were two things, but that was sort of my takeaway. And so, Pete, we'll let you take us out here. What's the takeaway on DevOps for those watching?
I think that the two things. So the first point would really be, if you want, if you're evaluating DevOps, whoever you talk to, just make sure that the first language they speak is common sense, and that common sense, that they have experience, those two things together are really what a professional should be doing, is talking common sense, and they have the experience to base that common sense on. Although that sounds counterintuitive, the experience sometimes helps you understand the mistakes, so therefore you can come to a resolution about what actually, is the reality. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, is you've just got to find what works for you. And you're not going to find the same problem the same way. You're going to find the same problem in different scenarios inside the same problem. And, really, you just got to find what works for you. And part of that is having a lot of humility about failure. And that if you've made a mistake, or if anybody else made a mistake, that isn't game over for them, that everyone makes mistakes. And that, in order to find what works for you, you're going to have to break a few eggs. So.
Oh, fantastic. Great stuff. Really appreciate it, Pete. Obviously, we'll put up links to all of your stuff when we post this, and really appreciate the time. And I think incredible buzzword that's out there, right? And I think this was a really good conversation about what does it actually mean, right? So I think it was really good stuff. I really appreciate it. So
thanks a lot for your time.
Yeah, listen. Thanks, Bill Bensing. Thanks, Phil Yanoff. Thanks, Pete Hurd. I'm Chris Lockhart. This was Consultants Saying Things. We'll see everybody next time. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Hey, great.